They say a man's home is his castle. But what they don't tell you is that sometimes the dragon at the gates doesn't come with fire. It comes with a clipboard, a pastel blazer, and something called community guidelines. My name's Jonah Henderson. I'm a retired carpenter, a third-generation landowner. And up until last summer, I didn't know a damn thing about HOA politics. I thought if you paid your taxes, mowed your lawn, and minded your business, the world would return the favor. I was wrong. What started as a simple violation notice nailed to my barn turned into a full-blown war for my land, my legacy, and the soul of our neighborhood. This isn't just a story about paint and property lines. It's about standing your ground when the system pushes too far. The morning sunlight crept over the hills of Silver Creek Ridge, a quiet little town tucked between pine woods and forgotten rail tracks. Jonah McAllister, 68 and semi-retired from a career in humanitarian architecture, sipped his black coffee on the porch of the house he'd built with his own hands. He wore flannel, boots, and a peaceful scowl, the kind that comes from surviving both war zones and Home Depot weekends. But that morning's peace cracked like a dry twig underfoot. Nailed to the old barn door, waving gently in the breeze, was a bright yellow sheet that hadn't been there the night before. Jonah walked up slowly, the kind of slow that comes when you already know something bad's waiting. Eyesore violation, non-compliant structure. Immediate action required. Jonah chuckled bitterly. "So it begins," he muttered, tearing it down. The barn in question wasn't just wood and nails. It was history. His grandfather built it in 1959, through storms, droughts, a damn near tornado. It had outlasted 3 generations, 2 recessions, and even Jonah's first marriage. And now, some HOA rule, passed under quiet ink and unbothered neighbors, deemed it an aesthetic offense. And the woman behind it? Margaret Hale, HOA president. Steel gray hair curled into perfection, voice like a silk rope, and ambition sharp enough to slice asphalt. She called herself a unifier. Jonah called her a professional meddler. Jonah didn't have to wait long. By the time he tossed the paper into his trash barrel, her powder blue Buick was already pulling up his driveway. She stepped out, clipboard in hand, pastel pantsuit catching the light like an omen. 2 board members flanked her, nodding like bobbleheads. "Good morning, Mr. McAllister," she chirped, with a smile that never reached her eyes. "I doubt you mean that," he replied. She ignored the jab. "We've had a review. Your barn violates newly approved color and design standards. It must be painted to conform, or removed within 30 days. He crossed his arms. "It's a barn, Margaret, not a billboard. My grandfather built that thing before you were old enough to spell violation." She gave a sympathetic tilt of the head. "Which is exactly why it's time for an upgrade. Heritage is lovely, but harmony matters more. A soft neutral would do wonders. Taupe, maybe, or coastal gray?" Jonah looked past her to the barn. Its red paint was faded, but proud, like a flag left out in the weather. "And if I don't," she smiled wider, "daily fines, followed by legal action if necessary." Jonah didn't answer. He just nodded slowly, turned, and walked back toward the house. Margaret thought she'd won. He didn't argue, didn't slam a door, didn't cuss. But something in his silence felt seismic. That night, Jonah drove into town. Hardware store, paint aisle. He asked the teenage clerk for the most violently pink paint you've got. The kid raised a brow. "You mean like Barbie pink?" "Barbie's too soft. I want migraine-inducing. I want flamingo in a nuclear reactor pink." 2 gallons and a 6-pack of beer later, Jonah stood in the moonlight beside his barn. He looked up at the stars and whispered, "Let's give 'em something to talk about." He started painting at sunrise. By noon, neighbors were slowing their cars to stare. By evening, someone had posted a photo online with the caption, "When the HOA says no red, and you say bet." The barn glowed, neon pink, loud, proud, unapologetic. It hummed like a dare. Jonah stood back, hands on his hips, grinning like a man who just dared a thunderstorm to strike twice. Margaret's car screeched up 10 minutes later. She stumbled out, aghast. "What have you done?" Jonah sipped his coffee. "I followed your rules. You said no red, never said no pink." Her jaw clenched. "You cannot be serious." "Oh, I'm serious as a stroke, Margaret." And just like that, the quiet war of Silver Creek Ridge had turned hot. Not with violence, but with something far more dangerous: defiance painted in electric pink. And Jonah. He wasn't just repainting a barn. He was reclaiming a line, drawn in history, dug in memory, and now glowing like a beacon for every neighbor who'd ever bit their tongue. This wasn't about aesthetics anymore. This was personal. It didn't take long for the war to spread beyond Jonah's fence. By the end of the week, the neon pink barn had become the most photographed structure in Silver Creek Ridge. Teenagers posed with it. A local artist painted it in watercolor and sold prints at the weekend market. A TikTok influencer from the next town over drove 2 hours just to film a dramatic reading of the HOA violation notice in front of it, complete with violin music and a wind machine. The barn had gone viral. But not everyone was laughing. The Silver Creek HOA, led by Margaret Hale, went from smug to seething in less than 72 hours. Their carefully curated suburb, where all homes matched like pastries in a display case, now had a blemish they couldn't unsee. Worse, it was beloved. Margaret's next move came swift and calculated. Jonah received 3 new citations within a week. One for his mailbox, excessive wear and tear, one for the non-regulation height of his hedges, and another for the unauthorized decorative elements in his front yard, namely, a pair of gnome statues his late wife had placed there 30 years ago. He found the last one particularly offensive. "These gnomes were here before Wi-Fi, Margaret," he muttered, shaking his head as he read the notice aloud to his dog, Baxter, who sat loyally by his side chewing on a tennis ball. Then came the letter. Certified mail. Thick envelope, legal letterhead. Inside was a formal notice of escalation. The HOA had begun proceedings to seek a court order for forced removal of the barn, citing community disruption, mental stress among residents, and potential lowering of property values. Jonah laughed when he read that line. "Property values? My barn's got more value than your laminated rules." But the real punch came when Gus called. Gus Mercer, Jonah's best friend and a retired civil rights attorney, had been quietly tracking the situation from his ranch 10 miles out. The moment Jonah forwarded him the letter, Gus did what he did best: dug deep. 2 days later, Gus pulled into Jonah's driveway in a dusty old Ford, holding a manila folder thicker than a phone book. "I found something," he said, flipping it open on Jonah's porch table. "Turns out, Margaret's got more riding on this neighborhood than she lets on." Yeah. Inside were property records, transaction histories, and emails Gus had acquired through public records requests. "She's been buying up properties on the edge of the subdivision, ones she fined into submission, then flipping them for profit." Jonah stared at the papers. "So, this isn't just personal?" Gus shook his head. "It's business. She's turning the HOA into a cash machine. Your barn? It ruins the uniform aesthetic she's pitching to out-of-town investors." Jonah leaned back in his chair. His mind ran through every visit Margaret had made over the years, every snide comment, every veiled threat, and it all clicked into place. "She's running a scam," Jonah said. "Not just that," Gus added. "She's planning to rezone this whole end of the ridge. I saw the draft proposal. She wants to turn it into a luxury microlot community." Jonah's stomach turned. "They want to bulldoze the past," he muttered. "Start from scratch." Gus nodded. "And that barn? That's their first domino." The next morning, Jonah walked his property line, slowly, deliberately. The soil was dry but familiar. He paused by the barn, brushing his fingers along the wood his grandfather once sanded with bare hands. Then he walked inside. In the back corner, under a dusty tarp, sat his old survey equipment. He hadn't touched it in years, but it still worked. And with Gus's help, Jonah began drawing a line Margaret Hale would regret ever crossing. Because if she wanted to fight over aesthetic value, Jonah would give her a lesson in legacy, one coat of pink at a time. The Silver Creek Community Center had never been this full. Usually, HOA meetings drew a sleepy crowd of a dozen retirees and the occasional concerned homeowner. But tonight, every folding chair was taken. People lined the back wall, fanning themselves with laminated agenda sheets. Teenagers leaned against the windowsills. A local news van idled outside. Jonah Henderson walked in, wearing his Sunday flannel and a dusty pair of boots, the kind he'd once worn to lay the original fence post behind his barn. He didn't say a word, just walked to the third row and sat beside Gus, who handed him a legal folder and a bottle of water. At the front of the room stood Margaret Hale, flanked by the other board members, her pastel blazer spotless, her smile strained to the breaking point. "Thank you for attending," she said, voice tight. "Tonight we will be addressing multiple instances of community disruption, violations of neighborhood standards, and the matter of one non-compliant structure that has attracted considerable attention." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. She cleared her throat and continued. "Let it be known that the HOA has followed proper legal procedures. The barn in question remains in violation, and the homeowner has refused to comply." "Because you lied!" someone shouted from the back. Heads turned. It was Rick Malone, a quiet war vet who hadn't spoken at a meeting in 5 years. He held up a photo, Margaret's signature on a rezoning proposal. "You fined me for my porch light being too bright," he said, "all while you were trying to sell my neighbor's home to your cousin's firm." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Malone, this isn't the time." "No," said Jonah, rising from his seat. "This is exactly the time." He walked to the front of the room, folder in hand. Margaret tried to block him, but Gus was already there, stepping between them like a linebacker in denim. Jonah opened the folder and held up the old zoning map. "This here," he said, pointing to the ridge, "was never part of Silver Creek proper. My land was grandfathered in under a separate deed. The HOA charter doesn't apply to my property. Never has." Margaret opened her mouth, but Jonah kept going. "And this." He pulled out a color-coded spreadsheet. "Shows a pattern. Fines issued. Homes foreclosed, then bought and flipped by shell companies tied to Margaret Hale's family trust." Gasps echoed around the room. Gus added the knockout punch. "We've already submitted this to the county and the state attorney's office. You won't be issuing any more fines, Margaret. You'll be answering questions under oath." The silence was thick, broken only by the sound of someone standing. It was Elena Perez, a single mom who'd been fined twice for a cracked driveway. "I say we vote," she said. "Right now. New board, new rules." Cheers followed. Margaret sputtered, "You don't have the authority." But no one was listening anymore. A voice rose from the crowd. "All in favor of removing the current HOA board?" A sea of hands shot up. And in that moment, something shifted. Not just power, but pride. The neighbors who once stayed silent now stood tall. Not because Jonah fought with fire, but because he reminded them who owned this land. That night, the pink barn stayed right where it was, lit up by string lights and surrounded by laughter. And Margaret Hale? She left in silence, her pastel blazer disappearing into the dark, swallowed by the very community she tried to control.